I am Nina Altschiller, the president of the League of Women Voters of Coastal Georgia. Our program tonight focuses on what is one of today's most important topics, redistricting. How Georgia handles drawing maps will affect congressional and state and local elections for the next decade. We will be taping this program and we'll make it available on our website. So if you have a friend who couldn't attend, please let them know or watch it again, because there'll be a lot of information I think all of us could listen to twice or maybe even 3 times. It is my great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Adam Van Brimmer, who is the opinion editor of the Savannah Morning News and SavannahNow.com. In his role, he writes a regular column that focuses on politics, among other topics, and hosts twice weekly podcasts. He's in his studio tonight that feature interviews with newsmakers of the day. He served as the opinion editor since 2018, and this is his second stint with the Savannah newspaper, having previously worked as a reporter covering sports, business, and news from 1999 to 2013. He lives on Wilmington Island with his wife and 2 children who attend the Savannah Chatham Public Schools. He's active in his church and enjoys participating in outdoor activities and playing competitive sports. And like any true Ohio native and resident of the South, he loves to watch college football. Adam?
Right. Thank you, Nina, for those kind words. And also thank you for inviting me to moderate this panel discussion. Pretty excited because this is my kind of forum. It features 3 insightful panelists who know redistricting backwards and forwards. And that means less talking from me, which I'm sure everyone will be grateful for. Before I introduce the trio, I want to do a little housekeeping. As Nina mentioned, we are recording this discussion and it will be available at the League's website at www.lwvcg.org. That's hard to kind of say that fast, but again, LWVCGA.org, or just search League of Women Voters of Coastal Georgia in your favorite search engine. That will post sometime late tonight or early tomorrow morning. So if you missed part of it or want to share it with a friend, please do so. Also, we encourage the audience to pose questions for the panelists in the chat function of this Zoom. However, we do face a hard stop at 7 o'clock. So if I don't get to your question, it's not because I don't think it's worthy. It's just because we ran out of time. With that, I will introduce the panelists, starting with Greg Bluestein. Greg Bluestein is a political reporter who covers the Georgia's governor's office and state politics for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. He joined that newspaper in June of 2012 after spending 7 years with the Atlanta Bureau of the Associated Press, where he covered a range of beats that included politics and legal affairs. He also contributes to the AJC's Political Insider blog. He's a graduate of the University of Georgia with degrees in journalism and political science. He's also a Savannah Morning News alum, working here as an intern back in the day.
You remember?
Be assured we didn't teach him everything he knows. He's learned a lot more since then. Thank goodness for him and for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Greg is also the author of a new book titled Flipped: How Georgia Turned Purple and Broke the Monopoly on Republican Power. The book is scheduled for publication in March 2022. Also joining our panel is Ken Lawler, who is the chairman of FairDistricts Georgia, a nonpartisan nonprofit organization that works to encourage a fair and transparent redistricting process in Georgia. Its focus is to fight gerrymandering, the practice of drawing legislative district lines to favor one group over another, with the goal of reforming Georgia's process for drawing state and federal electoral maps. Thanks to an innovative partnership with the Princeton Gerrymandering Project, Fair Districts now have the same big data formerly only available to state redistricting committees, which allows us to equip legislators and citizens with the non-biased statistical data needed to understand existing maps and to evaluate new ones as they're developed. A graduate of the University of Michigan, Ken spent his business career at IBM. He is a keen photographer, and aside from Fair Fight, is the blogger-in-chief of our imperfectunion.org, a nonpartisan, multi-pronged effort to reform the U.S. political system through education, motivation, and action. The third member of our panel today, who we're hoping is going to join us here sometime in the next few minutes, is Representative Carl Gilliard. Representative Gilliard represents Garden City and parts of West Savannah in the Georgia House. He was born in Savannah and attended Chatham County schools. His mentor in life was the Reverend Hosea Williams, a major civil rights activist. And it was under Williams' guidance and because of the loss of two friends to senseless murders that Carl returned to Savannah to act against the violence then prevalent in his city. Among Carl's many accomplishments, he was responsible for founding the largest youth group in the nation, Project Love. He currently leads the Feed the Hungry organization, a 501c3 whose mission is to feed, restore, and add dignity to the working poor. He recently was the original author of House Bill 479, which repealed Georgia's citizens arrest law, which was passed during the 2021 legislative session. Coastal Georgia residents are fortunate to have this hardworking, dedicated man representing us on the Legislative and Congressional Reapportionment Committee, which is made up of 14 Republicans and 4 Democrats. Needless to say, it is a star-studded panel. We're going to open this forum with each panelist giving their own insights on redistricting. Greg, we're going to start us off. You have the con.
Well, thank you. I get the heavy, weighty task of giving you guys a broad overview. But first, thank you so much for having me. I wish we were in person. I was looking forward to getting back down to Savannah. I actually might be there next week because it looks like John Ossoff is going to stop by for a visit or two. But as Adam said, I was a proud intern. I think it was in 2002, back when the morning news was still on Bay Street. I had a blast. My entire family is from just up the coast in Charleston. Hyman Seafood is my cousin. My Bluestein's is a store that just closed on King Street. And all sorts of relatives up there. And then I have a relative down the coast too. David Bluestein was mayor of Darien. I've only met him once, but he is a distant cousin of mine as well. So we've got family in Darien, and we're Jewish. I don't know if they are, but they owned the Piggly Wiggly for a while. So we always thought that was funny in our family, that Jewish people own the Piggly Wiggly. So with that aside, I always like to quote University of Georgia famed political scientist and one of my teachers, Charles Bullock, who of course calls redistricting the most political activity in America. And it is a brutally partisan process that is unfolding before our very eyes. It only happens once a decade, as you all know. And we have the privilege, the pleasure, the danger, you can call it all three of those, to watch it unfold right now. Why is it such a bit brutally partisan process? That's because what's at stake is power and control, nothing but that. Not just power and control, but we're now in one of the most politically divided states in the country, a state that, of course, narrowly backed Joe Biden, narrowly flipped both U.S. Senate races in the January runoffs, but continues to be dominated by Republicans at all the other levels of state government. Republicans control every statewide constitutional office. They have pretty hefty majorities in the state legislature right now. So the Republican lawmakers who now control this process, they won't make any promises that redistricting will be much different from when Democrats controlled the process, or from a decade ago when the maps that they redrew were released with very little notice, were passed without any changes really, and split up cities and counties in dramatic ways. Lawmakers back then, they crafted the maps behind closed doors before their public release. And as you could expect, many Democratic-leaning metro areas were split into multiple legislative districts with lines drawn in a way that gave the Republican majority an advantage. The election right after that 2011 process led Republicans to gain 1 U.S. House seat, 6 state House seats, and 2 state Senate seats. But this time it's a little trickier. The state's increasing diversity, with the white population in the state, in the latest census data at least, shrinking to 50%, poses a new challenge for the map makers on the Republican side to try to create favorable districts for themselves. They also must comply with the Voting Rights Act, which prohibits racially discriminatory maps that dilute the voting strength of African-American voters. But also, to another wrinkle on that I'm sure Ken will address in detail. But this is the first redistricting years, redistricting, since a 2013 Supreme Court ruling where that found that maps in Georgia and other states with histories of discrimination don't need to be submitted to the Justice Department for approval. So now there's no pre-clearance. So in some ways, the census makes it much more difficult for the majority party to redraw districts. In others, though, it without preclearance, it could be a little bit smoother of a ride for Republicans. Right now, what we know is the fastest growing state house and Senate districts are currently held by Republicans, mostly in the exurbs of northern Atlanta. Cherokee, Forsyth, Bartow, those are all areas that had double-digit growth. Those are all areas where we can expect to see new and smaller geographic sized legislative districts be drawn. In the U.S. House, that also affects things because there is nothing more that Republican lawmakers would love to do to make life much more difficult for Lucy McBath, who represents parts of Cobb, Fulton, and DeKalb County, and Carolyn Bordeaux, who represents parts of Gwinnett and Forsyth County. One or both of them will be for sure targeted when these final maps are drawn. And those exurbs I just mentioned, particularly Cherokee and Forsyth County, will play a major role in how those districts will be drawn. But at the same time, in rural Georgia, many areas represented by Republicans have stagnated, creating the possibility that some of Republican lawmakers will be drawn into each other's districts because they lack enough population to justify the current numbers. What we hear a lot at the Capitol from lawmakers, Republican lawmakers, is essentially, hey, Democrats did this in 2000. They did this in 1990. They did this in 1980. They did this every decade. They heavily gerrymandered maps. I love this quote from Speaker David Ralston, Republican. He said after 2001, when Democrats drew redistricted gerrymandered lines, he said that was an attempt to maintain power in a, quote, gravity-defying way. Well, now he's got control of that gravity, right? He's got those Newtonian philosophies behind him right now. And you're right. Back then, it's hard to justify, right? Looking back at some of the things that the Democrats were eager to do to maintain control. You can see. I'm sure Ken has some of these examples, but you can see create districts drawn all the way from Savannah to Metro Atlanta, as you guys know very well, the Cynthia McKinney era. You had multi-member legislative districts with several districts that had multiple lawmakers. It's hard to have one. It was hard to argue that there was equal representation when you had multiple members of the state legislature representing you in the same chamber. And essentially, what Democrats did back then, the most possible seats were placed in inner city Atlanta and rural areas back when Democrats controlled both those. It's important to remember back then, rural voters were overwhelmingly Democrat. And the fewest possible were in suburban areas that were predominantly Republican. That calculus has flipped. The cities, the urban areas remain Democrat. The suburbs have dramatically changed, especially around Metro Atlanta, and I think you make the case around Metro Savannah as well, to tilt more decisively Democratic. And the rural areas and the exurban areas are now where Republican strongholds are. When you look back at the Republican redistricting, the first time they had power of this process in GOP history in Georgia, they of course redrew lines to benefit their party. Now Democrats fear that the districts of Carolyn Bordeaux and Lucy McBath could be shaped in a way that make electing a Republican more likely and increase the GOP's 8-6 congressional delegation majority. Republicans acknowledge that can happen. They just say they're repeating history. We're fortunate in a way with this discussion too, because we weren't expecting any sort of map out until, at least I wasn't, until the eve of the special session. And in this case, I was driving home and I got a call from a source in the Senate office who said, hey, we're giving you a 20 minutes heads up on the maps. And I was literally in the car, so it was not like I was about to write a story. I said, hey, can I just tweet these out? So I think it was Monday, Tuesday. The maps came out. We didn't have the data set, so it was hard to deduce much from those initial maps. Now we have the data set as well. And we'll be able to show them later on in the program. But essentially, they surprised me. I thought Republicans were going to go out, and we just talked about there's an 8-6 GOP congressional delegation majority for the U.S. House. I thought they'd go for a 10-4. I thought they would draw both Lucy McBath and Carolyn Bordeaux's district to be more competitive. But there's a risk in that. And the risk is you might be able to draw those districts competitively, that maybe even in a way that withstands legal challenge for a cycle, maybe 2 cycles, but you could risk, if you're Republicans, you could risk losing those for the rest of the decade. So instead, the Senate took, I guess that you could say it's the safer path for them if you're thinking in the partisan ways. They're sacrificing the 7th district. They made Carolyn Bourdeaux's district a lot smaller and a lot bluer. And at the same time, there it is. Thank you for sharing the tweets. But at the same time, they made Lucy McBath's district much more competitive. In the end, I expect that to be how the maps end up passing. Lucy McBath is the one that who's probably going to be in a much more competitive district, while Carolyn Bourdeaux is safer. That's not because of personalities, really. I mean, if you were a Republican power broker scheming at the Capitol, you'd probably want to go after Carolyn Bourdeaux because she's less known as a personality. She doesn't have nearly as high profile. And frankly, because she's a white centrist, not a African-American, more liberal lawmaker. But given the geography, given the fact that Gwinnett County, which was a Republican stronghold forever until 2016, given the fact that Gwinnett County is now a cornerstone for Democrats in Georgia, and it's not going to change. There's no indication that Gwinnett's going to tilt back anytime soon. That you saw at least the GOP Senate kind of raising its hands and saying, we've lost Gwinnett for good. I did expect, though, that 10-4 map. I expected them to relent to a map that we're seeing now. And I thought they'd start off in a much more partisan, aggressive position. And then later on, pass a more moderate version of the map that everyone said, oh, at least they compromised. Instead, they started there. And that is why I think there's some consternation in the state house right now, because it puts them in a pretty rough position. Do they go out and be the bad guys? Does the House go and propose a map that is that 10-4 that makes both those suburban seats competitive? Or do they have to agree with the Senate and kind of not look like the mean guys? Or are we all just, completely confused and they end up passing a 10-4 map in the end when this is all said and done? That's why there's so much drama. And we've been spending a lot of time talking about the U.S. House seats, but we did mention the legislative seats at the beginning of the program, which are also going to be all up in our all up for grabs, all redrawn. I live in the suburbs of Metro Atlanta. I live in the 6th district. What is the 6th district now? In the Senate map, I live in Hank Johnson's district because they're giving all of North DeKalb to Hank Johnson because it's such a blue territory right now. But it's important to note when the 6th district was drawn back in 2011 as Tom Price's district, it was seen as so Republican that Nathan Deal, the governor, who was not a fan of Tom Price. Remember, Tom Price had endorsed Karen Handel over him, and they were not on the same page on things. There's no love lost between those two men. So they decided to make his district a little bit more challenging by putting my area into it and taking out one of the exurbs. And back then, my area was still Republican, but not nearly as not nearly as competitive as it is now. Now I'm represented by a Democrat named Mike Walensky, who went to high school with me in the state house. And there's a good chance that Mike Walensky is drawn into another district in Gwinnett. There's all sorts of shenanigans that happen on the legislative level because unlike U.S. congressional candidates, they don't have to live in the district, and the state legislative level, you do. So there's a lot of lawmakers I know who have recently moved who are trying not to tell the powers that be where their new address is. I mean, that's the extent things get. And one more thing to add, in this map that we saw from the state Senate, 4 congressional lawmakers are drawn out of their districts, out of where they live, out of their homes. Carolyn Bourdeaux would no longer live in the 7th. Lucy McBath would no longer live in the 6th, according to her aides. Those are 2 Democrats. 2 Republicans were also drawn out. Andrew Clyde, he represents Northeast Georgia. He was drawn out of his district. Athens would now be in the 10th district rather than the 9th. And Barry Loudermilk, his precinct is like just outside the congressional lines. It's all, it doesn't necessarily, it's bad for optics. It doesn't necessarily matter, of course, because they can still run for each of those seats, regardless of where they live. David Scott has not lived in his Atlanta district in decades, I think. It's been a very long time since he's lived in his district. But for the optics of all that, of it shows too, Republicans who control the strings here, who dictate what happens. They're not just going after Democrats. That's where personalities do get involved. That's where you could see the speaker who doesn't like a certain lawmaker, a Republican lawmaker, the lieutenant governor, or the power brokers in the state Senate who don't like a particular state senator. That's where you can see some down surface changes that will be a little harder to pick up on, but expect a lot of personality clashes to help define that process. That's where it gets very dramatic and very personal. So that's my broad introduction, and I will cede the floor to Ken.
Yeah, thanks so much, Greg. And you'll kick it over to Ken Lawler now, who is with FairDistricts Georgia. Ken, thanks for joining us, and take it away.
Well, pleasure to be here. And Greg, thanks for that great overview. I think you did a really good job of setting the stage for the backdrop of how all this stuff takes place. I'll amplify a couple comments that you made. Number one, you talked about transparency. And you talked about the fact that in all these hearings that were held across the state in June and July, there were three big requests. Number one, be transparent. Show us what you're doing. Number two, I want fair districts, right? Fair, of course, is a pretty broad term, but we'll talk about what that means. And number three was keep my community together, right? So we don't think the process is that much more transparent this year, but I will say we are thrilled to have the first map literally 5 or 6 weeks before the special session starts. So I got to give the map drawers in charge right now credit for at least getting us a map to work on. We'll see how much it resembles the next one that comes out, when the next one comes out. We could see another map tomorrow. We have no idea. But I'll take an early map as opposed to a late map any day of the week, because now we can start working on it, right? So you got to give them a little bit of credit for being a little bit more transparent. However, it still is largely a process that takes place behind closed doors. And we've asked for and advocated for many changes to the process. Starting back in April, our group and other organizations wrote letters to try to ask for more transparency, to release more data, to give us a 2-week review period, hold hearings after the maps are released. We're not seeing much of that, but I'll take an early map. That's like one step in the right direction, score one, right? That's good. I also think that the history is pretty relevant here. You went back to the 80s and 90s. Our group, Fair Districts, first of all, we're a nonpartisan group, so we get to be equal opportunity critics of anybody who engages in gerrymandering. In 2001, the Democrats were in charge, and they were in the throes of losing the state. And they drew a very bad gerrymander in the maps. And of course, those maps failed a Supreme Court test in 2004. And so even though they were pre-cleared through the Justice Department process that was in place under the Voting Rights Act, they were pre-cleared, but nonetheless, they were thrown out in a federal court suit in 2004. And the maps the Congressional map passed, but the State House and State Senate maps did not. And subsequently, those maps had to be redrawn by a court for the next election, and then ultimately the Republicans took charge in 2005 and redrew them anyway, because they said we're going to fix that mess that was left by the Democrats, right? That's always suspicious when you're redrawing the maps between census points. What's going on there. Then in 2011, of course, and the Speaker Ralston's quote I think is very apropos, which is that the maps that we drew in 2011 were pretty fair. We achieved pre-clearance. He forgets to tell you that yes, the Democrats also achieved pre-clearance back in 2001, but still those maps failed. None other than Eric Holder, the former Attorney General under Obama, says that pre-clearance is a good deterrent, but it is not a cure-all. I mean, you don't always get fair maps, right? Our study of the 2011 map redraw, followed by the 2012 election, was that Republicans lost more statewide votes. Their statewide vote share, when you think about governor's races and presidents, they decreased their statewide vote share, and yet they achieved a supermajority in both the State House and the State Senate. So those gains that Greg Bluestein talked about were very material, because then they had a veto-proof majority in the General Assembly, despite the vote share over a long period of time has been creeping down, and now we're at the point where it's a swing state, frankly, right? So those two pieces of history, I think, are relevant, and we just want people to know that the map drawers today are kind of betting their case on the fact that the last time they did it, it was quite fair. We got pre-clearance. Everybody was happy. Even the Obama Justice Department gave us pre-clearance. And our view is not so fast. The maps were not fair when you look at the results. And really you have to look at the results. Because these days, back in 2001, Greg referred to this, the maps had these weird contrived shapes stretching all over the state. There was a state Senate district that went from Macon all the way to Columbus, for crying out loud, right? So you could look at the map and go, that's a problem right there. You can't do that anymore, because with modern data and software, you can be very surgical about how these maps are drawn, and you can be very, very, precise about how you want the maps to achieve your political end. And at the end of the day, the law allows the party in power to put their thumb on the scale, and both parties do it. I mean, it's just a fact of political life here, and that's why Charles Bullock said it is the most political activity in America. I'm going to jump into a short presentation to kind of give you some data points that I think will pretty illustrate really well the challenge that we face, and really that the map drawers face, but then we as citizens face in trying to advocate and get involved in this process. So I'm going to try to share my screen here and just walk you through some information that I think will help illustrate what's going on. Hopefully you can see my screen. Is that correct? Good. Okay. So, Georgia has changed. I mean, we all have that message. I think, first of all, let me just introduce our organization. I think most people know who we are, but in case you don't, we are a nonpartisan organization. Like I said, our only mission is, trying to fix gerrymandering and make the process fair. In the long run, we'd like to fix the process. We'd like to have better legislation. We'd like to have a constitutional amendment that would give us an independent commission like other states. We're a long ways away from that. So this year, our challenge is, how do we live within the current process but try to advocate for a better outcome out of the current process? And as we said, we're a swing state, and we think that our legislative and congressional districts should reflect this new state reality. Now, that's easier said than done, right? Greg referred quickly to the census data. The rural loss, urban, two big outcomes, right? Rural loss has led to urban growth. You can see that in the map on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, diversity reigns. And diversity in Georgia used to mean black voters, but now it's this multiracial ethnic dimension as well. So the white population in 2020 is 50.1%, barely a majority anymore, and yet you've got this multi-diversity model that you have to account for. Somehow the maps need to reflect this natural diversity of Georgia, and that's a challenge for map makers, to be honest with you. And then politically, if you just look at the last decade politically, let's go back to the 2012 election. It was won by Romney in this state by 3.3 points. Again, the 2020 presidential, again, a squeaker, Biden by 0.2%, right? Our view is that Georgia has arrived as a swing state. It is not all blue. It's not all red. In fact, what you see is this polarized pockets. If you look at the map, left versus right, there's still a lot of deep red. There's lots of pockets of blue. They've moved around a bit, but at the end of the day, not every district is a swing state district. Many of the districts are going to be Republican. Many are going to be Democrat. The challenge for map drawers is, how do you reflect that diversity that we saw, and how do you reflect fairly this political landscape? Now, again, our view is that they should fairly reflect the political landscape, but of course, if you are a partisan politician and you own the map drawing process, you don't have to be fair. But we think that there's ways to get the process to be more fair. And that's what we're up to, right? So what do we mean by fair maps, right? It's respecting the political preferences of voters, the natural political preferences of voters as they're distributed across the state. You're going to have red districts, you're going to have blue districts, but let's get the right number for each party. And in all other things being equal, competition is better. Competition breeds excellence. So the more competitive each district is, the more competitive the maps are in general, good thing for Georgia voters, not necessarily a good thing if you are an elected leader and try to hold on to your power, right? Reflecting diversity, again, it's not just a black versus white question anymore. It's this multidimensional world. And it's not only those districts where a minority group constitutes a majority of the district, but now we have opportunity for what we call influence districts, which are districts where the population is less than 50% for a minority, and yet if it's in the 37 to 50% range, that minority group has the opportunity to influence the outcome of the election, and so those districts are worth preserving as well. And then lastly, the tricky dribble in all this is honoring communities of interest. Big conversation across the state in all those hearings, honor my community, keep my community together, right? There's no rigid way, there's no codified way to measure that. But at the end of the day, you have to respect that. And so our view is that legislators need to draw the maps, considering communities, considering these political preferences, but then measure them for fairness. And that's where we come in. Our advocacy this year in Fair Districts is all based around a partnership that we have set up with the Princeton Gerrymandering Project to bring independent, nonpartisan benchmarks or your fairness tests or yardsticks. And we've now developed these, and I'm going to show you what the benchmarks say, because we have the benchmarks. We actually just released the benchmarks a week ago, and actually the last release of it was the day before the map came out, so we're lucky we got those done. We've already looked back at 20-year history of this and can show that the state was gerrymandered twice, been through that history already. Now we're looking forward and saying, so based on the 2020 census, if we look at this three by three matrix, let's look at the state house, the state senate, and the Congress. What should be the partisan balance, the natural partisan balance, not the unnatural? How many competitive districts can we eke out in a good map? And what's the proper minority representation? So the way we do this, the way Princeton does this with us, is basically we create a simulation of 1 million maps. We've already drawn 1 million maps, so we're way ahead of the legislature, right? We've drawn 1 million maps for state house and state senate and for Congress. We use the 2020 census data to draw these maps so they reflect the current population. These maps all comply with the state laws, the Federal Voting Rights Act. They basically model the process done by the Assembly, with one exception. They have no partisan intent built into them. So they are politically neutral, but they should ultimately reflect the political preferences of Georgia. And so what we do in 1 million maps is we measure the partisan lean, we measure the partisan competitiveness, and we measure the minority demographics. Our view is this, real simple. If you can create 1 million maps, that should give you a pretty good idea of what Georgia should look like. And if a map is drawn fairly, it should fall within these benchmarks. So our intention is, I'm going to show you these benchmarks now. Our intention is to take the maps that are drawn, measure them against the benchmarks, and tell our legislative friends, hey, you've achieved, you're fair or you're not, or what's some degree of fairness or not in these maps. Now, it's really fascinating to understand what these benchmarks are telling us. I'm going to start with looking at the state senate. The bottom half of this graph is the partisan lean of the state senate back in 2011. So again, with many thousands of maps, you can see that when you draw 1 million maps, you don't get one kind of map. What you get is a whole bunch of different maps, but they tend to cluster. And so the maps on the bottom of the page say that the natural Republican distribution or advantage was around 7 to 11 districts in 2011 based on how voters lived at that time and what their voting preferences were as expressed in the 2012 election. That's just a natural result of the voting preferences in Georgia. So you can see that the advantage or the split was about +7 to +11 on the Republican side, therefore -7, -11 on the Dem side. But now look at the top graph. We have the partisan gap in Georgia has narrowed significantly. So this swing state status does get reflected in the natural lay of the land. And so now what we think is that a fair state senate map should have somewhere between a 0 to 4 advantage. 0, of course, means there are some maps that are completely legitimate that would be 28 seats each. Wouldn't that be a very interesting thing to have? I don't think it's likely we're going to get that, right? Because there still is a bit of a natural Republican lean here. But it's only to the tune of maybe, +2 if you look at the top peak of that distribution. But it's somewhere between 0 and 4. If we see a map produced by the state senate that's off the edge of this distribution, we're going to say, no, that's not right. You're clearly creating a map that is way too favorable to you. But we expect the map to be somewhat leaning towards Republicans, and this is just based on the natural political lay of the land in Georgia, because Democrats cluster in cities, Republicans are spread out. So message, the partisan gap has narrowed. The same thing is true if you look at the state house. I'm sorry, I skipped the wrong chart. I'll show you in a second the state house view. It's very, very similar, right? The other thing to look at is how competitive are the districts, right? So in 2011, we did 500,000 simulated maps for 2011, and the number of competitive districts in the state senate should have been 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I mean, anywhere between 2 and 9 is a good number, but a middle, 5, 6, 7 would be a decent result. What does the enacted map that we lived under show? It's 1. Oh, there was only 1 competitive district designed into the map. So clearly the map was engineered to create safe seats. 2021, what's the competitive number? We think it should be somewhere between 1 and 7, but again, a number 3, 4, 5, 6, somewhere in that would be good. We'll see what we get when we get the map. And we can tell all this by looking at by bouncing a proposed map against this million map simulation. So we think there's an opportunity to create a more competitive map. We shall see what we get. Lastly, from minority representation. The first thing we look at is the traditional view of black minority representation. We think that there should be around at least 16 black majority districts in the state Senate. That's up 1 from last time around, where today we have 15. And there should be somewhere between 0 and 3 what we call these influence districts, or just slightly below the 50% number, but enough to where the black population in the district could have exert a strong influence on the election. In addition, now, because we have this multi-diverse model in our representation, we have this view of all minorities, and we think we're going to see even more districts that when you add the black to a minority coalition number, it's a much broader number. We should see a significant number of districts where groups of minorities form a majority, right? We also think we're going to see some number of districts where, for the first time, Hispanics are a significant influence in the state Senate. So again, these are all benchmarks that we've created. We're going to measure the maps that we get against these benchmarks for state Senate and come back and say, hey, you met the target or you didn't. Quickly, the state house, similar story. Back then, the state house, the seat range was maybe plus 20 to plus 29. It's narrowed by about 20 districts. We're at a plus 2 to plus 9. So a plus 5, 4, 5, 6 map would be reasonable model for how the people in the state actually vote and how they clustered and live. So again, it's slightly tilted towards Republicans, but that's the natural tilt. The unnatural tilt will be if there's a map that's way off the edge of the distribution, we're going to say, hold on, that's not right. Competitive story, very similar. Very few, only 10 competitive districts in 2011, where there could have been anywhere in the mid-teens to 20. The opportunity this time around is again in the mid-teens. It's the 9 to 22 is the full range, but anywhere in the mid-teens would be a good number. We'll see what we get. Lastly, in terms of minority representation, again, we're plus 1 in terms of black majority districts this time around, at least plus 1. We think there's an opportunity for about 48. And in the influence districts that are just below that 50% threshold, somewhere between 3 and 11. We think, again, we're going to see a significant number of minority coalition districts. That could be an additional, an additional 15, 18 districts where you have minorities forming a coalition. We think for the first time ever, it's possible to draw at least one district where Hispanics are an outright majority. We're hoping to see that in the map. That would be a good outcome in terms of representing that group, and we expect to see districts where Hispanics and Asians would also influence the outcome. So again, this question of how do you represent this multi-dimensional diversity, we think we have a handle on what we expect to see in a fair map. Congress. So in Congress, it's a very interesting story, right? Basically, the gap has narrowed by about 1. So in 2011, 4 to 5 Dem districts, 9 to 10 Republican was a reasonable number. Where we are today, what our benchmark says that the new number should be maybe plus 1 to plus 2 for the Republicans, minus 1 to minus 2 for the Democrats, or it's either 6-8 or 5-9. Of course, 6-8 is what we have elected today. It appears to us that the new map is in the 5-9 range. But you have to look at other characteristics in terms of competitiveness and so on to really judge that map. And we're still going through that process, as we'll talk about in a second. Competitive districts, again, we had no competitive congressional districts the way the map was drawn last time. We're hoping to see between 1 and 3 would be a good outcome. 1 would be obvious. And we've had, of course, in Georgia, we've had 2, the Georgia 6th and 7th. We would like to see competitive, other things being equal, having satisfied all other criteria. Competitive is better, and so we would love to see 1 to 2 at least competitive districts in the congressional map. And lastly, on minority representation, it's about the same as it would have been 10 years ago, where we have at least 4 black majority districts, perhaps 1 influence district, an additional district where minorities as a coalition are the majority. We don't think there's any districts where Hispanics and Asians have enough concentration in a big congressional territory to influence or heavily influence, but again, they would be part of those coalitions in the minority coalition districts. So that's kind of the benchmarks that we see. and this is just a chart that summarizes, which I'll skip, but you'll have in your package, that says, the summary of all these, and you can compare it to where we are now. Clearly, what we're saying is that the gap, the takeaways are the partisan gap has narrowed, and there is increased opportunity for minorities to be represented. So now we put this to the test. We got our first map. We are still analyzing this map. We don't have an official statement about this map yet, so I can't really tell you what we think. We've talked to Princeton about it. They have their view. They're about to publish their scorecard, and we're going to publish a statement probably tomorrow, which is kind of an initial take on it. But we're looking at those things we talked about, which is, what has happened. Clearly, the activity centers around what's happened in the 6th and 7th, because that looks like to where most of the change happened. The 7th was really important because it was way too overpopulated because Gwinnett had grown so much. So a lot of population came out of the 7th, moved over to the 6th, but it's changed the character of those two districts dramatically. I think Greg gave you a good overview. 7 appeared to be a pretty safe Dem seat now, and 6 is either much more competitive or even leans the other way. So our question really is, and some of the questions we're going to ask are, as these changes got done in this map, is any group or any particular district being unfairly targeted? Of course, that's the speculation at the national level. People are always asking us what's going on with the Atlanta suburbs. That's a big swing in the Congress, etc. Again, we're not ready to render our official opinion yet, but we are absolutely working on it and should have some initial thoughts very soon. How can you get involved in this? Join our action team, right? We are pivoting to the point where over the next 5 to 6 weeks, as these maps come out, we're going to be issuing calls to action. You'll be able to call your legislator, tweet if you like to do that, get on social media. We will be working on some marches or physical presence at the Capitol to let the legislators know that we're watching. And it's the good news is that the public comment portal on the legislative website is still open. You can go to bit.ly/publiccommentga. Please make sure that you use those are case-sensitive bit.ly links, but that will lead you to the legislative website where you can start commenting on what you're seeing in terms of the maps and help amplify our view of these maps. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing there. I know that was a bit of a whirlwind tour, but just give you a sense for where things are headed. We're a data-driven organization. You might have guessed that from what I just showed you. We think here's the thing. This is the first time ever that Georgia citizens have been armed with the same data and the same powerful tools. So we've democratized this process. And this is going on in every state. Georgia's not unique, but I will say that we're thrilled that Princeton Gerrymandering Project, one of the premier groups in the country, chose Georgia, at our urging naturally, but chose Georgia as a focus state because they said Georgia is a battleground and we'd like to see it come out fair. Thank you.
Ken, thanks so much for sharing that presentation with us. Representative Gilliard is in the process of joining us. I've been texting back and forth with him. I think he's going to be on here shortly. So in the meantime, Ken, I want to follow up just a little bit with you and the whole concept of a competitive district. Is that a district where a race is typically settled by X amount of percentage points, or how do you define a competitive district?
Yeah, great question. The current research that we are using says that it's about a 46.5% to 53.5% margin. So it's about call it a plus or minus 3.5 point margin. A while back, it would be more like a plus or minus 5%. It looks like it has narrowed a bit. I think voting has become a little bit more polarized generally. Professor Abramowitz over at Emory, Professor Alan Abramowitz, has some research that says it's so dead on now that you can predict a congressional vote based on the presidential vote in any precinct. I think he's right. It's slightly different when you get down to the state house and state senate because it's more local people that right? Greg knows his buddy is representing him. It becomes a little bit more, but that number is pretty narrow. It's again plus or minus 3.5%, so 46.5 to 53.5 is the stat that we're using when we measure competitiveness. It's actually we've actually made the range a little tighter. If you kept plus or minus 5 points, you'd have more competitive districts just because it's a wider target, easier target to hit.
Gotcha. Obviously, we're coming up on November the 3rd and the start of the special session. do the redistricting. I think a lot of people are kind of the mind from some of the events that the legislature has done around the state, and then some of the maps and other things that are coming out that this is kind of a done deal. What does FairDistricts Georgia, what do you hope to accomplish this cycle, and then beyond that, but more focused on this cycle? What do you hope to accomplish this cycle? Whether you give the maps a thumbs up or the thumbs down, what is the end goal?
Well, I mean, obviously our big goal would be to have all the maps being fair. We're not sure how close we'll get to that, but I think we have a shot at least keeping them in bounds. That would be a step forward. But back up even further than that, the public is paying attention. This cycle feels different to me, and I wasn't around in 2010 doing this, but the folks I've talked to said the public is just much more aware of this stuff. The public is watching. There are many advocacy groups like FairDistricts Georgia across the state who are watching this process, who are advocating for fairness, who are worried about their communities. There's a whole community mapping drive underway with Fair Count, who is the group that dealt with the census. And so getting the advocacy groups to the table and getting them to have at least a voice in the process, we think is already a big win. We're going to take partial credit for this map coming out. We have been asking since April. What we said back in April, 20 organizations wrote a letter to the committees and said, we want 2 weeks from when the map is released to the special session. Because we know what happened, as Greg said, what it was in 2011, the map came out Friday, votes on Tuesday. Well, what is that? That's nothing. So we're going to take partial credit for at least forcing a map out of the machine. And now we'll see how close that is to how many, we don't know how many more iterations we're going to see. But I give them credit for getting a map to us in advance. We don't know when we're going to see the other ones, but we'll take credit for at least that much. I think the legislators are aware that Georgia being a swing state, we're under the microscope nationally. The process is under a microscope now. So we hope to have raised our voices, our collective voices, enough to make a difference. One other just key point that I'll mention, and I'll just give you one sneak preview of something that's different with the Congressional map. Greg mentioned this, that cities across the state have been split historically, especially in the state house map. 2/3 of the city, the small to medium cities in Georgia, were split in the state house maps the last time around. The Congressional map has already shown a step in the right direction. Athens used to be split between 2 congressional districts. It's now in one. Let's call that a win. It's a small one, but the more we can keep cities together, we think cities are important because they're a natural community of interest, even more natural than a county, and even a sub-city level, there's going to be communities of interest. But there's all this talk about preserving communities, community views, and keeping cohesive representation. Let's count a win that Athens, in fact, is now in the same congressional district and not split anymore. We'll see how it fares in the state house. The state house, it was split in the Georgia campus is split down 3 ways. Right down the middle of the campus, 3 different houses. We're going to find out whether we've made a dent in that problem or not. So, in the short run, we've raised our voices. What we'll do in the coming years, we're going to be advocating for changing the process wholesale. We've got to have a fairer process so that no matter who's in charge, right, it's in their best interest to follow standards, to ideally have an independent commission. We hope we are starting to move the needle towards a more fair process.
Great. Thanks for that, Ken. And we're going to have more questions for Ken here at the end. But while Ken was talking, I saw Carl Gilliard has popped up on my screen. So very glad to have Carl here. Of course, Carl was involved or is involved in this whole redistricting process with the legislative committee. So Carl, and I'm going to count on you, Carl, to talk for at least 2 minutes because I'm going to run down the hall to get some water. So I'm going to turn it over to you. I know you're a preacher. It's 2 minutes is, just getting warmed up, but please take it away. Thanks, Carl.
Thank you so much, Adam, and to the committee. And I always see great leadership in fair districts. I remember constantly going from city to city and hearing the echoes of the people, and the people want fair maps, fair districts, fair opportunities, fair representation. One of the major reasons that I wanted to get on the committee was to make sure that there wasn't a process of gerrymandering, a process of people not being heard. All over the state of Georgia, people want equal representation and right representation. There were times that the Democrats were in charge at one time and There might have been some gerrymandering, and now the Republican leadership is in position, and the people of Georgia want fair representation. It is my posture to, in the minority, to still be that voice to make sure that we do have fair representation and that the districts duly represent the people, that we're not going to pick our voters, but the people are picking us in reference to voters. And so we look at, even in Chatham County, the growth in different areas. My district is 162, which is Garden City, the West Side community from Hudson Hill, West Savannah, South Side as far as South Side to Leeds Gate to the right of Hunter Army Airfield, the 165th National Guard, a very diverse community. And at the same time, we recognize the diversity and also being that in that minority. And so the key thing is that leadership must really represent the people. And when you look at the growth in other areas from Fulton County and beyond, we've got some growth in cities, even here in Chatham County. Pooler is one of the fastest growing cities in the state of Georgia. So we recognize that growth. And the thing is, moving forward, politics out of it, we have to do the book of Spike Lee. We got to do the right thing. And so that's where we're at. In the absence of one of our committee members who recently was laid to rest, Representative Mickey Stevens was one of the other members on reapportionment from the Chatham County area. So being one of the Lone Rangers with great representation from our party, that's our posture. And everywhere we went across the state of Georgia, that was the cry of the people. They want fair representation. I do want to thank organizations like FairDistricts and others, because what they did is provide the data to say that in the future, we do need to have an independent commission that would actually look at drawing these districts. I might be a little partial because I love my district. And so, we don't want to have that partialism where parties are saying, we want to protect our seats, we want to protect the interests of just us. It is the state of Georgia, especially with Chatham County. It's very, very important with the growth of Chatham County that we have fair representation.
So, Representative, since Adam's still not back, I'll ask you a question. Do you have any idea? Were you surprised the Senate map came out a couple of days ago? And two, do you have any idea when the House map might come out?
We've been watching on pins and needles to the left and right. I was a little surprised. I think the main things that have fallen in place has been that we knew that going into a special session would probably be the first week of November. So we got that a little bit right. The speaker will say when frost hits pumpkins, but I think we knew that the first week of November. We're waiting and anticipating. And one of the things that I'm doing, even in anticipating, I plan on doing a town hall virtual meeting with the public to let them see what has unveiled before we go into session. We're facing, as I said before, Senate Bill 202 was not the monster. I said that was just the preliminary of what was to come. And so where people were talking about Jim Crow 2.0, I said it's Jim Eagle, that the eagle has landed, and we're facing a mighty fight in reference to this upcoming special session. And so the big thing that I think that's a detriment that we didn't do out of all the things we tried to do right. Yes, we went across the state of Georgia. Yes, we heard people, but we haven't done due diligence in giving the people a process of their voices. We heard them and we listened. So now my focus is when the other part of the House map comes out is to relay what we have to the public and let them be involved at some point. And right before session, let them see the map that is being proposed. That's very important.
Thanks for covering for me there, Greg. Carl, I'm going to remember that you didn't keep it going long enough for me to get back. I'll get you back on that later. But wanted to go ahead and ask some panelists some of our questions now, and I'm going to start with a rather obvious one, but I think that it's probably a rather complex question. But how does gerrymandering disenfranchise voters? What are the many ways that it might disenfranchise voters? And let's start. Go ahead, Ken. You're probably the subject matter expert on this one. Why don't you go ahead and take that one?
Well, I would suggest that Representative Gilliard probably knows it on the inside. We can view it on the outside, but I mean, the obvious point is that your voice does not matter. If you're in a district that has been, packed one way to elect a particular person, that person doesn't. And you don't vote for that person. If that district isn't competitive, that person does not have a motivation to listen to you. They can represent their portion of the district, which is their party. And so you get disenfranchised immediately at that level. And if you have a need to address with with your legislature, and that's your person, you don't always get a fair personal hearing. I mean, I've talked to legislators in my area. I've had meetings with them. They're courteous and all that good stuff, but not always clear that my request is taken seriously, to be honest with you, right? And that's because they're being driven by an agenda, which is the majority party agenda to try to get some things done in the legislature that not everybody in my district likes. So really, there's a couple points. One is that as an individual level, your voice is diluted, which is not the way voting is supposed to work. And then you look more broadly and you say, well, when you have a legislature that has so many safe seats in it, what you get is extreme legislation. Right? You get legislation that's favored by the majority party and has a particular agenda on their part, whether it's, and this happens on both sides. Don't get me wrong. We're equal opportunity critics, as I said before, right? But when you have extreme legislation, a lot of safe seats, the elections don't matter, and that means that majority party is pretty safe to do almost anything they want in terms of legislation, right? And that's what happened in 2012 when the Republicans gerrymandered themselves to a supermajority that's veto-proof, for crying out loud. And so it has, at the state level, that's another way of the voices as a state as a whole being disenfranchised.
Yeah, as Ken said, Carl, you see this on the inside, and I'm sure because you're one of 4 Democrats on the legislative committee, you're not only hearing it from your own constituents, but you're hearing it from elsewhere in the state. What are you hearing from voters who are really concerned about gerrymandering, whether they think their district is gerrymandered now or whether they're concerned that it's going to be worse come the middle to late November?
I'll give you a scenario. You get an individual that runs for office and their district is 40% Republican and 60% Democratic. The Democrat that runs for office wins the election by the majority. They get in office, they still represent the total capacity of that district. Whether they are African American, they still represent all that are in that district: Vietnamese, Black, Hispanic. And so that's the kind of mindset that anyone should have. But the average voter has seen that in November they spoke. Georgia spoke in November of 2020. Georgia spoke in January of 2021. And we still have not been satisfied to the point of hearing the voices, and we're determined to turn the hands of the clock back. And so what is happening now is on both sides, people want the representation. They want, their districts that have too many representatives and their districts that have too few by virtue of size. And so it's important that when it comes to the process of power, that once again, we don't pick our voters pick us. And my district is a diverse district, and I have all types of individuals, and I'm their representative. As the young people say, period. I'm their representative, and I'm going to make sure that I hear their needs, and that's the process with gerrymandering. It's not about preserving the power. But I do understand that we've been in position before, and I've talked to several individuals, Dean Smyre and Representative Hughley and others that were there back in the time frame the Democrats were in control. And the one thing they kept talking about is fairness. And that's what we are expecting in this particular upcoming session.
Greg, you heard Carl talk there about the whole idea of legislators, when they're elected, they are representing everybody in their district, no matter what letter is next to their name. When you talk to lawmakers, whether it's at the state level or at the federal level, it seems to me, and maybe I'm misinformed, that is kind of getting lost with lawmakers now, that for them, the whole idea of getting reelected has to do with the fact that they represent more, they represent pretty much only the people of their own party. How in your mind, how does that play into redistricting, and how does it play into the way our elections are running these days?
Well, I've got the perfect example. Look no further than the heartbeat bill, the anti-abortion bill that passed in 19. Very hard vote for a lot of lawmakers. There's 5 Republicans who walked and voted all. There's 1 Democrat who crossed party lines to vote for it. But otherwise, it was a pretty partisan vote. I was watching very carefully Houston Gaines. He's the former student body president of University of Georgia, represents Athens as a Republican, or portions of Athens as a Republican, for reasons I'm about to explain, who was tormented over that vote, who ended up voting for it, faced tremendous pressure from his own party, who views him as a future legislative leader. He was sitting in I think his seat is either in the first or second row of the Georgia General Assembly. So he's surrounded by party leaders who are trying to make sure he's a young man. So they're trying to make sure he's kind of sticking with them. They're giving him some of the best other legislation to pass. He ended up voting for it. I could tell he was tormented by it because it's a tough vote. And but as we were mentioning, Athens is split not just in 2 districts, split by 3 legislative districts. It is the smallest county in Georgia. It's one of the bluest counties in Georgia. And if you're walking through the arch in downtown Athens, you're walking from one legislative district to another. There's a point just south of Sanford Stadium at a stoplight where 3 legislative districts converge. Where I lived in Russell Hall when I was there is a completely different district than Sanford Stadium is, which is a different district than Legion Field is. I mean, that's how close all this is. And so how do you have accurate representation of this is the disenfranchising part we were talking about. Athens, it's an easy argument to make that Athens residents, very liberal residents, are disenfranchised because their representatives, Houston lives in Athens, but is very conservative. And their other 2 representatives represent districts that stretch into Barrow, Jackson, Oconee, Walton, Madison counties. These are some of the reddest counties in Georgia. And they are representing Athens in the State House, one of the bluest cities in Georgia, bluest counties in Georgia. So that right there is your example. And I always look back to Houston because I know he was, I don't know what's in his heart. I don't know, what if he was given a truth serum, he would do in that vote. But I knew for a fact he was tormented by it. I knew he was struggling with it, but he felt like he had to vote that way because he doesn't necessarily have to worry about a general election, but he does have to worry about a primary challenge. And he would face a primary challenger had he voted against that. He would have made their entire campaign on the fact that he was not quote unquote pro-life.
That's fascinating. It really speaks to partisanship and the dangers that kind of go with it. Representative Gilliard, we got a couple of questions from folks here on the call. And let's start with one from Jennifer Highland. It reads, with so many eyes on the special session and on the process, how confident are you that last minute surprises may possibly be avoided? In other words, when you get a map that looks like it's a done deal, are you going to be surprised if it's not a done deal?
Today we celebrated the life of Representative Bobby L. Hill, and we dedicated an interchange to him. And one of the things I try to do is study to show myself approved. Representative Hill was a strategist. He strategized. And that's me. As we go into this session, I don't go in with my eyes closed. I know that on paper, we could say one thing. We could say we're not going to talk about crime. We're not going to talk about Buckhead. All things are possible. And so even with this upcoming map, I'm looking at it left and right. We just don't know. We have been in constant contact with our leadership, as well as I'm sure that the Republican Party has been in touch with theirs. As a member of the Democratic Caucus and on the board of the Black Caucus, we have the education process has been thorough to stay in tune, stay in touch. But at the same time, we just don't know. I can make a promise to tell you that I will keep my eyes very widely open and my ears open. And once I get the information, I'm going to disseminate it to the constituents of not only my district, but Georgia.
Another question for you, Carl, is you were one of 4 Democrats on a committee, I think of 18. How much influence would you say you have on that committee?
Well, going back to strategy again, the one of the things I desired to be on this committee, it was a strategy. I remember going back to Representative Mickey Stevens. He would tell me that he was on the committee, and I always wanted to make sure Chairman Al Scott would say you need to be on that committee. I have a lot of relationships across the Capitol, and Adam, it goes across both lines. I'm the voice of reason, but I think one of the biggest things is that it's got to be accountability. We got to do it right. Even as a Democrat, I can honestly say people know that my whole posture is to make sure that there's an accountability. When Leader Abrams was leader in the House, there was a lot of respect for her, even in that light, because they knew that she knew the laws and that she was going to speak truth to power. And so I'm just adamant and focused and energized and getting ready for this session. And the whole focus is trying to make sure that we have the tools to make this fair. It has to be fair. I think if we let them down on the fairness of this, drawing these districts, the whole process of voting and diplomacy is going to go down the drain, and people are going to get disenfranchised on both sides, even going back to the polls and all the above, because they'll feel that their votes are not counting because of the way the districts have been drawn.
Does what has happened over the last year with a lot of the challenges to the election with 2020 and a lot of voter distrust, and then with Senate Bill 202, of course, some people are adamant against it and some people are adamant that it needed to be in place. Does that even make this moment a little bit more fragile, that redistricting is that much more important?
I think it does, because all across the nation we're seeing signs. You talked about the heartbeat bill, and I remember, like you're talking about whips and people in the caucus, but my focus even then was people don't have the right to justify to tell someone to do it their body, even though you have a belief. And so there was a lot of pressure, and even moving forward on this, there will be a lot of pressure party wise. I'm a lot partial. I'm just thinking about, the across the board, the numbers, they have to add up, and the representation has to add up, and we must have fair representation. I would hope that we, as Republicans, are in position now, and they've had the minority of time to be in position, that they will set the example and do the right thing, that this does not go into the court system. But at the same time, we're also having some different opportunities that if it does, I'm sure that there's several organizations that will hold them accountable.
If I could just amplify one thing there to answer your question, Adam, is that, think about this way: fair elections equals fair voting procedures and fair districts. They're two sides of the same coin. So in the session in January through March, we saw the SB 202 work around voting procedures, and again, you could argue whether those were good or bad, but there was a lot of debate about whether those changes were necessary. This is the second part of the coin. This is the other side of the coin. So I think 2021 is going to be a pretty interesting year when you sum it up and say what has happened to the fair election process in Georgia. Take that into account in 2021, and I would be shocked if that didn't become a big discussion in the campaign next year. To be honest with you, we don't get involved in electioneering at all. Fair districts, we don't endorse candidates, parties, none of that. But we can observe and say, look, this has clearly been a heck of a year, and depending on how the maps turn out, if they're fair, that's great. Half the coin's good. That's what we're advocating for. But I think those two together, they're two parts to the same puzzle, and it all boils down to fair elections, which is what's more basic than that? Come on.
I know all three of our panelists are very, very familiar with the maps, both before the 2020 census data came out and since. As you've looked at the changes that have happened since the census rolled down, what are some of the major changes? What are some of the things that Georgians need to really understand and know that changed in that census data that's going to play into redistricting?
Well, I think the breakdown of the demographics, the Asian and Hispanic community, the growth in those respects. You also look at those areas that are dissipating in reference to white voters, and then the dormancy and stagnation of, I would say not stagnation, but dormancy of African Americans in other areas. So there's growth in a lot of different areas dealing with demographics. And so you look at Chatham County, the same parables, even in my district, 11% Hispanic in my district alone, probably one of the highest districts in Chatham County Hispanic population. So, you know, the breakdowns are there. The numbers are in front of us. I remember being in Athens, Georgia, and hearing the students voice their concerns about, you know, the representation that they felt. And those were students that were white voters. That did not look at color, but looked at the concerns. So the concerns and then demographics are going to be a big posture in this upcoming, redistricting.
And I'll add to that. I mean, in Atlanta, one of the dominant stories of the census was that the city of Atlanta is no longer majority Black. It's much more even. How that affects the race for mayor in about a month-ish is going to be really interesting to see. And as we were talking about earlier, the exurbs are exploding. So Republicans have this unique challenge because they're all these rural districts have even less population, so they're going to have to expand their size in order to meet the legislative threshold. But at the same time, Republicans will be able to draw more seats into Forsyth, Cherokee, Bartow. Those are all areas that have gotten a lot of growth. It's still going to lead to all sorts of difficult questions and difficult issues, even for Republicans. And there'll be a lot of pain on the Republican side too, in a sense. It's not like, just as I said earlier, it's not just going to be targeting Democrats. There'll be some Republicans who will be forced to make decisions either to run against their colleagues or to step down or to seek higher office even, right? But that's one of the takeaways, at least in Metro Atlanta, that is a dominant story here. People were kind of shocked that even as the state's population has gotten much more diverse, the cities of Atlanta has gotten whiter.
Yep. I'll also mention, I think one other big takeaway, and I'll echo what Representative Gilliard said, was diversity is no longer a Black population, white population question. It is multidimensional. The growth in Hispanics as an ethnic group, Asians. And so we're starting to see that, as I mentioned in my statistical overview, which was you're seeing now opportunities for representation specific to Hispanics. We think there's at least one Hispanic majority district somewhere in the State House available, right? Should be drawn. Frankly, it should be drawn, right? And again, the Voting Rights Act helps protect the minority side of it. There's no protection on the partisan gerrymandering side. Unfortunately, we are at the whim of the people drawing the maps there, right? But traditionally, the map drawing has been about Black districts versus non-Black districts. The problem is more complicated, so the map drawers have a bigger challenge, and yet we have to recognize that this multi-racial, multi-ethnic minority view is now this is Georgia. We're different than we were, very different than we were 10 years ago. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that diversity, whether that diversity is well represented across these districts, right? And again, we've only got one map to look at so far, and we haven't really drawn any conclusions yet. But there are some changes in that map that make us question, like, well, what's going on in Congressional District 2 right now? That's a district that has changed a bit, and by the numbers, it is no longer majority Black as it was before that map came out. Is that an issue? What do you do about that, right? So this multi-dimensional ethnicity and racial thing is, this is a more complex puzzle to solve, is the bottom line.
And can I horn in there real quick? Because one of the questions about lawsuits, whether or not we expect lawsuits, we probably will expect lawsuits. And if District 2 is still the same, the way that it was drawn in the Senate map, we will almost certainly see a lawsuit, because that was drawn from a majority, is now a majority Black district the Sanford Bishop represents. And it would be African Americans would lose the majority in that district. The way it's redrawn, it takes away parts of, it adds rural parts, takes away parts of Macon, Bibb County. And the attorneys I've talked to, who almost immediately reached out to me after I posted the maps, were like, this is, we're focusing a lot on what's happening in the suburban districts because that's where the political competition could be. but the legal folks are focusing on the second district because that is where the legal action would be. I don't think that's how it will end up because there's lawyers in the room where they're drawing this, and they know this as well as we all do. But at least right now, that's what's getting folks in the legal side of things revved up.
Oh, I want to ask you this one that just came in from Cuffy Sullivan, and that's what are some of the meaningful ways that League of Women Voters members can get involved to encourage fair mapping? Of course, we're getting close to the frost being on that pumpkin. So what can we still do in terms of either sending correspondence to legislators? What are some of the things that we could do?
Adam, I would think one of the things that I'm trying to search for is what do people feel the members of the League of Women Voters in their prospective districts? What do you feel? Not just getting we get a million emails saying we want fair districting, we want to make sure there's no gerrymandering. But what do you feel as a legislator, as a representative? I need to know what people are feeling in reference to the maps. Because when we were touring in different cities, one of the things I did hear was, this is what we feel about our community. This is our pulse. The other thing is to monitor the process. I don't know how COVID-19 will we have lobbyists physically at the Capitol, presence at the Capitol, but to monitor the process, to stay in touch with legislators like myself. There are individuals that really want this process to have due diligence. Dr. King said, give us the vote and we will change the course of this nation. We'll never change the course of this nation if our vote is ignored and our process is ignored. And so I'll just say, indulge yourself in getting involved with those legislators, to hold them accountable and to conversate with them about what you really feel, because that's going to be important. You were talking about the districts, Greg. I remember Greg Morris as a key Republican who gave up his seat. Now he's with the Department of Transportation. They know that those numbers are not lying. So we just need to still stay connected. Don't leave us out there it's only 4 of us. And I want you to understand that only 4, but trust and believe those individuals are in this fight. And then you got other individuals on the other side. And I must commend some of the process has been somewhat fair in that respect. We're waiting to see how it plays out. But we need everyone's involvement.
Yeah, I just want to echo a comment. I think the league has already made a huge difference, and I'll tell you why. We attended many of the hearings across the state. Representative, I think you were at almost all of them, as I remember. I don't remember each and every one, but the league was instrumental in amplifying this notion of these independent benchmarks with Princeton. That was a message that we started because we built a relationship with them. But we heard many League of Women Voters speakers at these hearings advocate for that as a tool to be deployed here, right? And I think that got us all a seat at the table. So I think the league across the state has already made their voice heard. You are a well-recognized force across the state. In some sense, Fair Districts is the new kid on the block here. We've only been around since 2017. We weren't even involved the last time around, so we're trying to jump on a moving train here and say, hold the phone. But the league deserves credit for helping raise the voice, and especially raising the voice around fairness and transparency. That really is the heart of this problem. And so I just want to say thank you to the league, and the coastal team in particular we've been talking to them for a few years now about it. And so just thank you. Just please, thank you so much for what you've done.
Thanks for saying that, Ken. We're running out of time, but we got a few minutes left, and I want to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole because I think it's something that we need to talk about before we let everybody go. And that's, everybody, when they think of redistricting, they think of U.S. House, they think of State House, they think of State Senate. The other piece of this is redistricting also goes all the way down to the local level. Can one of you, and Carl, you're probably the best to get us started on this, talk about how that process works, and are we going to, what are potential for us to see big changes in terms of our school board districts and changes of our city alderman districts and our county commission districts?
Talking with the, and we're planning on talking upcoming, the Metropolitan Planning Commission director and Chatham County commissioners and city officials. There are all types of possibilities. There are possibilities that the districts will change there are possibilities in the city of Savannah where you have all the men at large, all the women at large, that there could be actual districts with numbers, post so and so and post so and so. So the possibilities, because of the demographics and the way the districts will be drawn, anything is possible. What I've been doing is kind of just listening and hearing the desires of those elected officials. But here again, when the numbers come in, the numbers will be factual, and we got to look at all the possibilities. I was looking at something in the chat where they were talking about how does this affect, healthcare and all the above. Well, Medicaid expansion and all the above. We've got to get people in position that are not just party driven, that are people driven. And when we redraw those maps, they won't have a fear factor of just being aligned to the party. They'll just do what's necessary. We need Medicaid expansion right now for Georgia. It does affect all those things from your healthcare, public safety. As a person that developed the Chatham County Gang Prevention and Intervention Commission, we have problems with crime and violence and all the above. You got to get the right people in position in those through those districts that will be elected. That just because you don't have crime in the rural areas, you still care. And that's what it's about. It's got to be a difference in reference to the type of people that we're electing. Where if we're talking about Georgia, we're talking about Georgia. We're talking about Chatham County. We're talking about Chatham County. We're talking about the city of Savannah. We wouldn't have all this fighting. Adam, I had to throw that in there. But we've got to look at the demographics, and so it does play a role. And my hopes within the city is that there will be a few changes. I really, really hope that.
Is that something that happens during the special session, or is that afterward at the local level?
That could come with the local bill in the 2022 session. I think the main focus, once the maps are drawn, that they're going to show what they show. But it could be post this special session dealing with local legislation, charter changes, etc. It could be all the above.
How did I know you were going to break news on this forum, Carl? Thanks a lot. That's good stuff. Ken, when does FairDistricts Georgia go down to that granular level as well with local districts, or what kind of outlook do you take on those?
We actually aren't involved in any detail. We really focus on the State House, Senate, and the Congress. We've had a few conversations with people around the idea of can you take some of our suggestions on your process locally. We had a conversation with the city council folks from I think it was Sandy Springs. How do you fix the process? Because the process is no better anywhere else. Talk about standards. Try to get standards embedded in your local council methods for doing this. Get citizens involved. It's a lot easier to hear about your local communities when you're talking about a city, a small city. Let's just say. Atlanta's a pretty big place, but take a lot of these. There's tons of cities across Georgia. I can't remember the number, but in the range of 50,000 people, those are cities that could constitute pretty much one House district. But think about redistricting those city councils. That's a very manageable process compared to what is going on right now. So get your communities involved, and I think the onus is on the citizens to be very precise defining your community of interest. When you talk about a city, you can talk about you and your 3 neighborhoods around you constitute a community. Maybe it's a community that's centered on a church. Maybe it's a business interest like the Vidalia onion growers, right? Or coastal Georgia, the shrimping community. When you talk about defining a community of interest, make that community very well known. You can do it in this legislative process at the state level, but it's even more effective when you're talking about your local level, because you can influence that much more easily, right? So the onus needs to be on citizens to be very crisp and clear about what constitutes the community and why does that community deserve cohesive representation at the city level or the county level.
Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, one more thing I want to add is don't underestimate the likelihood, the ability of people in power to mess things up, even if they are drawing a district intended for someone or designed to do something. It could very easily backfire, even if all the numbers say it might not. And I always go back to the story. Legendary speaker Tom Murphy hated the fact, he's a Democrat, hated the fact that Newt Gingrich represented him in the U.S. House because back then Gingrich's district went all the way out to West Georgia. redrew a district designed to get Gingrich defeated, ended up basically moving Gingrich's district to the Atlanta suburbs. Gingrich moved out to Cobb County, won, used that district as a springboard to speakership. So these things happen, and it's happened on the other side of the party line too. So even if, fast forward a year, and even if your folks are in a tough position, your candidates are in a tough position, these things can backfire. Don't lose hope.
We had about 2 minutes left. I want to ask you this one, Greg, because I think you probably are. Well, I'm sure everybody has some insights, but I think you might have the best answer. And there's a chance here in between now and when the frost comes on the pumpkin that we might see some new voting rights legislation come out of Washington. What impact could that potentially have on Georgia's redistricting process?
There's a chance, but it's not looking good. Even as I'm here, I'm trying to keep tabs on what's happening tonight. It is looking rough right now for Joe Biden's agenda in Congress, and there's no telling how long tonight's voting process will be, or even if there are votes on the on his big priorities tonight. But the folks, even the optimistic Democrats I talked to in Congress, the aides and operatives, aren't expecting anything imminently. I mean, it is going to be a slug just to avoid a government shutdown later this year and to pass reconciliation bill, and then maybe sneak some voting rights language into the reconciliation bill might be the best chance. But the big concern for lawmakers is a HB 202 2.0, right? Is any sort of revisiting. There is a reason, by the way, that the governor very quickly called for the special session last week out of the blue in a way. And I think one of the reasons why was because Donald Trump took to his mass email and was bugging Texas. He was upset that Texas wasn't calling for an audit during their special session. I think the governor's office wanted to get ahead of that and wanted to get ahead of pressure on him to call for an audit during this special session. So he got the proclamation out of the way that does not mention any sort of audit, does not mention, frankly, it doesn't mention crackdown on crime like he had even said earlier. So the concern that the Democrats should have is revisiting election laws for a more restrictive side, not sort of changing Georgia's laws to adapt to a federal expansion. There could be some more restrictions or more attempts to revisit the 2020 elections, I should say.
Yeah, I'll just add one comment to that. I'll be a little bit more optimistic than Greg. I know the calculus in Washington is getting harder by the minute. The act that I think people should watch, if you want to understand something, is the Freedom to Vote Act. It's the new version of the voting rights thing that's been done, along with the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. But the Freedom to Vote Act, the reason it's important is because it could affect Georgia's maps now. It governs congressional maps only. But even if that act were to pass like in February or March, what that act does is it governs the use of any map in the next election. So in fact, if that Freedom to Vote Act passes as it's written, it would ban partisan gerrymandering of the maps we're working on now. It would include additional protections for minority groups on the maps we're working on now. So even if the maps are done in November and that act passes in March, it would apply retroactively, basically, because the law prohibits using a bad plan, a plan that violates that law. So I think that's one that's still worth keeping an eye on. No one's going to predict is it going to pass next month or whatever. But I think that, and we know that that's going to be all wrapped up in, can you work around the filibuster in the Senate? We get that. We understand that problem. I don't pretend to, I have a suggestion on how to fix that, but no one wants my suggestion. I'm not there. It's way above my pay grade, but I don't care. But watch that act, because that's got a possibility to helping us now. It's helping us between now and the next election. So if you want to take up the cause in Washington, we've written a letter to Senator Warnock thanking him for his leadership, and every member of our congressional delegation got a letter from FairDistricts saying, "This helps us now. Can we have it, please? We don't give up."
Good stuff. Great conversation from all three panelists. Thanks so much for taking your time and lending your insights to us tonight. I am going to kick it to Rosemary Mackey with the League of Women Voters to close us out.
Oh, there we go. Well, thank you all very, very much. First of all, thank you to our audience. We are so thrilled to have you, and we hope that this has fulfilled one of the areas that the League does try to do, and it really has three purposes. One is getting people registered to vote. Two is providing advocacy for voting rights, which we do. And three is providing voter information. And I think this really fulfilled that more than I could have ever hoped for. Redistricting is such a complicated issue, and you have really helped us enormously tonight. Thank you, thank you. And thank you, audience, for your questions. The League is 100 years old, and since 1937, I think, so maybe 73, backwards, has allowed men to belong. So we're always looking for new members to join us. So please go to our website, both men and women. We would love to have more members in coastal Georgia. We surely could use your help with all of this. Finally, to our panel, three incredibly busy men. Greg, we will look forward to reading your book when it gets published next year. And we love hearing you on Political Rewind, and we will keep following you. Ken, I know that we have a particular link because Cuffy keeps us on our toes with FairDistricts, and we thank her for that. And Representative Gilliard, how can we say thank you enough to you for all of the things you do representing us, not just your government work, but all of the work you've done for the public in general and children in particular. We are grateful to have you in our midst. And finally, by no means least, our wonderful, wonderful editorial editor of the Savannah Morning News. What a great moderator. I knew that we were on a winning ticket. I had no idea what a winning ticket he was. Thank you all very much. Thank you all for joining us. Come back next month, October the 28th. We will actually pick up on something Representative Gilliard said. We're going to talk about criminal justice and crime in Savannah with Patrick Skinner, who is a member of the Savannah Police Force and a very well documented and written author. I think everyone will enjoy him a lot. So put it on your calendars. Thank you again, and good night.